Hello and welcome to our weekly Power Lounge. This is your place to hear authentic conversations from women in digital who have power to share. My name is Amy Vaughan, and I am the owner and Chief Empowerment Officer of Together Digital. We are a diverse and collaborative community of women who work in digital marketing and advertising and choose to share our knowledge, power, and connections. If you're not a member yet and you're interested in learning more, you can at www.togetherindigital.com. And this week, I'm excited to be introducing to all of you Sahir. She is a senior attorney for economic empowerment at the Legal Momentum, where she leads the Women Valued initiative. Sahar engages in litigation, policy advocacy, and educational outreach to advance the economic security and workplace equality for women. With a focus on assisting women in low-wage work, Sahar has a background in economic justice and human rights. She previously worked as a policy and legislative attorney for the New York City Housing Authority and has worked internationally with organizations in Burma, Haiti, Iraq, Israel, South Africa, and the United States on issues including housing rights, gender-based violence, minority rights, economic security. Before law school, Sahar consulted with the Democratic Governance Group and the United Nations Development Program and worked with the International Democratic Governance Practice for the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy. She received her JD from Brooklyn Law School, where she was a SPAR Public Interest Fellow. She also holds degrees in international relations from the London School of Economics. Sahar, you've done so many amazing things, and I love your focus. If I ever had half of the brain cells probably needed to go into law, I just think the kind of work that you're doing is the kind of work that inspires a lot of our listeners. So I'm so grateful for you being here today to share some of your knowledge and experience and your Working Woman's Bill of Rights.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. I'm so thrilled to be here and to share some of our work with you.
Yes. This actually kind of came from a number of conversations. I found Sahar through Google. Julie, you'll be happy to hear this. Julie is our resident Google expert. If I need to find something, sometimes it just doesn't work. She just knows the right words to search. But there was something in a conversation I was having with a couple of members and other potentials. And it was really just about understanding and knowing what are your rights when it comes to where you work, and really making sure that between the employer and the employees, those things are understood, seen, and heard, because without that, what do we have to go off of? And so I had this kind of thought of Working Women's Bill of Rights. And so I Googled it, and there it was. I found your organization and reached out to you, and now here we are. And obviously, I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and I hope that our listeners are too. Can you give us a little bit more about how you personally came into this work and what really drives you to continue?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I have a background in international human rights, and having worked on projects in countries around the world, my focus was always to try to identify gaps in protection for some of the most vulnerable populations. And unfortunately, no matter where you are in the world, including in the United States, women are always among the most vulnerable. So wherever I was having to apply a gender-based lens in my work. A lot of my work was taking a gender focus. I was working on gender-based projects. And so even though it wasn't intentional, I was really developing all this background and experience on gender equality and how to advance it. So that's really what led me to land a position at Legal Momentum, which is the nation's first and longest serving legal advocacy organization for women and girls. And at Legal Momentum, as you mentioned, I work on legislation and litigation and educational initiatives with a focus on workplace equality and economic justice issues. And in terms of thinking more broadly about, how I came to this work, how, any of us come into this area, I think one thing that became apparent to me as I got older and had kids is that at some point as a woman, you are probably going to face gender discrimination in your career. And, unfortunately, discrimination is much more common than we think or hope. And in many cases, it can take a while for us to actually recognize it or come to terms with it, and to think about, how really to address it. In terms of how one engages in women's rights work, I think there's so many ways that anyone can take actions to really move the needle forward and to move us forward. I think one of the most important actions that we found through the work we've done consulting women kind of across the country at all income spectrums is that what you're doing right here can be one of the most effective tools, creating spaces for women to have conversations, to share their experiences, to access support and resources, and really build strength together. To some, that might sound a little bit amorphous in terms of an action item, but it's such a critical first step towards empowerment. We also work specifically with using the law to advance gender equality, but I think another really important way to effectuate change is for individuals to do so within their organizations by enacting policies that support women and families and that support diversity and equity and inclusion. We don't have to wait for the law to kind of catch up to reality. And in fact, if we do, I don't know how long we'll be waiting, because it's, unfortunate how long we've had to fight for kind of basic rights. So I think it's important to know that, we can be leaders in the way we lead our own organizations. And I think as we see more women coming up in positions of power and leadership and forming their own businesses, but even having conversations with each other and forming, women's groups within their organizations, there is this opportunity and ability to really push that change from within. And, I'll talk a bit more about what those policies look like as we dive more into the Working Women's Bill of Rights. And then in terms of the work that we do, I think there's so many pieces of legislation that need support, from the Paycheck Fairness Act to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and kind of doing outreach to support these bills and speaking up with your representatives is another way that I think anyone can move change.
Yeah, I agree. Leadership isn't a title. It's what we do and how we show up at any sort of action, to kind of go against the contrary of what we think is definitely leadership. And I agree with you too, that the idea of community working together, a community like ours, that's like the education awareness portion. And you're right, like until people are made aware and educated where we're lacking, then they can't go and say, okay, well, this law or this legislation should change. And so that is it is a good next step. I think one of the conversations I had when it sparked the thought of this Women's Bill of Rights, or this notion, is there such a thing, was when I was talking to a creative director. No, sorry, she was a general manager of an agency. She was from the UK and went to the Middle East. And it was such a obviously different culture, world, and environment, especially for women there in the Middle East. And so one of the things that she had learned was, as they were trying to hire women, there were certain things like, well, one, there was no paid maternity leave for women at all there. And I can't remember what
like in the United States.
Like at all. And we gripe about the US all the time because it's not great, but it is something.
I will note there is no paid maternity leave in the United States.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. There is no paid maternity leave.
We are one of just a couple countries that don't have it.
Disabled. We have short-term disability. So yes, right. And so and they also, when they were trying to bring and hire women in, I've worked overseas before, and I had the benefit of, we went to the UK, and when my husband got his work visa, I in turn got a work visa as well because of his visa status. Well, the country that she was working out of, when they would bring women in, there was a law saying that, like, men, if you bring your wives, your wife will get a working visa. Women, if you bring your husbands and you're getting hired and you're getting the work visa, it won't be free. It won't happen. And so one of the things that they started doing was pushing for that legislation for paid leave and for, that visa kind of stipulation to go away. And they managed to do it. It took years, but still, it was more about that awareness and, the conversation to start it that really helped lead to the change.
That's so true. And that's so important. I mean, sometimes it happens to us every day. We unearth a policy, and sometimes it can be in the most progressive states, that is horribly discriminatory, um, and and it's something you wouldn't even expect. And so I think that awareness is really the first step towards making change.
Yeah, it makes me think too about, and I don't want to go too far off tangent, but it does make me think about, especially with, since we're talking about paid leave and things like that, Roe versus Wade even being overturned for all of us, that's been a huge concern and worry. But what I'm seeing in America compared to other places and countries is now all of a sudden the companies and organizations that we work for actually have the ability to do for us what maybe our government can't, or if they don't do it, then nobody does it for us. So it's just an interesting predicament to be in when you are a woman stateside.
Absolutely. I think Roe v. Wade has really brought so many issues to the forefront of our minds that we weren't thinking about. And I think it's been really promising to see a lot of employers step up to try to create policy that supports women and their right to reproductive freedom. I think one thing we constantly try to remind employers is that there is a whole spectrum of what reproductive freedom means. And so as they contemplate changing policies to help women access abortions, that they're also looking back at their policies regarding some of these things that we've been pushing for so long, like paid family leave, like pregnancy accommodations, so that we're making sure that women are making real choices, and that they have the freedom to choose which path they want.
No, I 100% agree. Well, that just segues us nicely into kind of discussing what is the Working Bill of Rights, kind of high level, and why is it important? And we'll kind of go into the details of what some of those rights are here in a little bit. But
yeah, so I'll start by answering kind of the second part of your question first. Why is it so important? And I think we need to just take a step back, and if we look at the status of women in our country, we will find that across the United States, women are more likely to live in poverty. Women are more likely to be working a low wage job. Women are more likely to be living at the edge of precarity. And even for women who are not facing such extreme disparities, they're still worse off than men. And what's, I think, crucial to recognize is that all of this is born out of an economic structure that is discriminatory at its very core. And while there are a number of factors at play, I think one of the biggest we can think about is the motherhood penalty. And I think this applies whether you have children or not. Put simply, women are the ones tasked with care work. And not only is none of that work compensated, it results in these long-term financial penalties. Women can't work or have to take breaks in their career because they're caring for children. And then they're returning to work and they're having to juggle this huge task of doing their work and caring for their children. And I think some of that, that transfers to just this broader unconscious bias that this perception that women are less reliable, they're less competent. And I think that's in that way, it really impacts all women in their careers. And meanwhile, our laws deny access to crucial supports to level the playing fields. Women are, denied reproductive health and freedom, pregnancy accommodations, paid family leave, paid sick time, affordable childcare, flexibility to manage the realities of caregiving. And we really have very little recourse to fight for adequate or equitable pay. And so kind of contemplating this broader, very large problem, the Working Women's Bill of Rights really serves as a checklist to flag kind of the core touch points or areas where women tend to be economically disadvantaged or face discrimination. And in the Bill of Rights, we focus on 12 different areas. And by highlighting these areas, its main purpose is really to set forth an agenda to guide lawmakers and advocates and employers and individuals on how to close gaps and strengthen our existing laws and practices so that women really do have an equal opportunity to thrive economically and to thrive at work.
that's so great, because I think what it does is it sets a nice set of expectations up to start to work towards systematic change, which we all know is absolutely necessary if we're ever going to actually see, breathe change. So yes.
Absolutely.
How did the document come about? Like, what was it that inspired it?
That's such a great question. I think, when you look at some of the issues we're dealing with, you quickly find that they are often interconnected. And this is kind of something we've found in our work from speaking with women and looking at the data. Sexual harassment is often linked to wage insecurity. Pay discrimination is often born out of these unconscious biases about women being less reliable and competent, like I was saying, because of caregiving. And, women are denied the right to decide whether to carry out a pregnancy, but then they're denied any accommodations at work for that pregnancy, regardless of its impact on the worker or the baby, right? So it all connects. And I think when we started building up our work in this area, we found that there was a gap in tools and resources that approached some of these issues in an integrated way that reflects and captures the degree to which our current structure undercuts women from so many different directions at every angle, at every corner, taking away our freedom to make our own decisions, making those decisions for us, and then turning a blind eye to the real world consequences and outcomes. So we decided to create the Bill of Rights to really try and fill that gap and to dump everything in one place so that it was easier for us to make those connections, so that we were really seeing how deep and broad the impact is. And so that we're really forced to recognize that we can't solve this problem by just doing this or just doing that, that we really have to make comprehensive reforms.
Yeah, this reminds me actually of a really great exercise that I did within a cohort for She Leads Change when we were talking about systematic change. This is a great little piece of homework for all of you listeners. When you sit down and you think through all of your major life events, and that could be the choice to go to college or not go to college, the choice to be married or not married, the choice to live where you live, buy major purchases like a car or a home, write all those things out and give them space around them. And then afterwards, what we did was we would write in the systems, it could be financial, government, societal, what systems influence those choices and those decisions in our moments in life. And it could have been economic even because of like a layoff. So when you map out like the big parts of your life, it wasn't until that I did that I realized, I had to pay my own way through college. So that was an economic system held back. Like my dad was immigrated to the United States, and he didn't make as much because he didn't speak English right away, and he endured racism and all these different things as he was trying to come through and find his way here to make a better life for us. And so it is just amazing. Sometimes you don't think that the system affects you until you really kind of write it out and document it. And once I finished that exercise, I was like, oh my, you don't realize, like you said, you don't realize like one piece of law or systematic kind of situation can totally change, influence the outcome of your life. And when that's the case, it really shouldn't be. It shouldn't be at all. So is that kind of the goal of the Bill of Rights, like, is to kind of start to help make people more aware? And are they using it to make change in their organizations, change within their state legislation? What are some of the goals and what have been some of the outcomes of the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I think, I would say the overarching goal behind the Bill of Rights, in addition to kind of creating this more integrated approach where we're connecting the dots, is really to drive home the message that we need a comprehensive overhaul to achieve meaningful gender equality for women. In terms of some of the more tangible goals, I think one of the purposes was to set forth a broad agenda, but then also to look at some concrete action items that need to be taken. And depending on where you are in the Bill of Rights, like if you're talking about just prohibitions against gender discrimination, that's something we already have in place. We have a law in place, but there's so many problems with it. There are a lot of gaps that need to be filled. So in those areas, we're talking about, concrete recommendations for how we make those laws stronger. In other areas, we are really lacking in the necessary safeguards that need to be in place. And so really it's about pushing for that very basic infrastructure to be built. And I think one of the other purposes of the Bill of Rights is also to kind of balance the conversation a bit, to focus not only on disparities faced by higher income women, but also to look at the unique needs and rights of some of the most vulnerable women, including women of color, immigrant women, and and women in lower wage industries.
Mhm.
And I think it's so important, the example you raised of your father. And one of the things we're thinking a lot about is about immigrant families and what they're dealing with. And I think so many of the women we speak to who are lower wage immigrant women, there's this sense of like, I've come to this country, I just have to, I have to deal with these barriers in order to succeed, and I will do what has to be done. And I think a lot of our conversations with these women start with uh, kind of rebuilding their perception of what their lives should be like, kind of communicating that in a world where women have rights, it
Right.
shouldn't have to be this way. You should not have to struggle to this degree to be able to care for your children and to have a home and to be able to work. There is this sense that you should be able to have those basic necessities met. You shouldn't have to work 3 jobs and balance childcare on top of that. That is not the vision we have.
That's a whole nother conversation, healthcare. Oh, for another day.
Yeah.
How could women who are hearing about this and hopefully checking out the Working Women's Bill of Rights, how can they use this document to understand and express their rights to their employers? Because that's going to be the bulk of our listeners, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think a lot, as I was talking about, I think so many of the protections outlined in the Bill of Rights don't exist yet at the federal level, and while many of them do exist at the state and local level. So the Bill of Rights is really aspirational at its core. That being said, all of what's captured there are protections we believe are absolutely fundamental. And I think there's several ways that women can use the document. I think first, for so many, discrimination, like I was saying, takes a while for us to process. And it takes a while to see it for what it is. And I think the Bill of Rights is really useful in framing the issues in our mind and really bookmarking them so that when a violation occurs, we're quicker to identify it and to take action. And then second, I would urge women to use the Bill of Rights as really a starting point to look at which of these protections exist in your state or have been adopted by your employer. Or as I mentioned earlier, if you are an employer, to consider adopting some of these protections within your own policies. Um, I think that's really critical. Um, we found, we have a national helpline. A lot of women call from across the country, and so many women, including people who are you know barely educated and really thinking about women's rights, still don't know about some of the protections that exist within their own jurisdictions, or really don't think to utilize them, again, because sometimes you just don't you're not anticipating that you're going to come across some of these violations. And it's I think it's really important. I can't I think overstate how important it is for us to be educating ourselves more about what protections exist, because that goes a long way. I think even in terms of preventing violations from escalating, because we found in so many scenarios employers will just tell women like, oh, you're not entitled to this benefit, we don't have this benefit, or you know simply tell someone, um, in many cases people get terminated or demoted because they're even raising an issue. And I think all the while there's a law in place at the state or local level that protects you, and even being able to speak the language of the law kind of can protect you as you're going into conversations with your employer. And I think third, I think women can use the document to really start having conversations about what more can and should be done. This is a document we worked on, but obviously there's a whole breadth of experiences that women have across the country, and really every day we're building um, upon this comprehensive framework about what gaps exist, what needs to be filled, and what are the different barriers that women are facing, both in the workplace but in terms of their economic security.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've seen and heard that from the things that my dad went through to the women that, we talk to here and Together Digital, just trying to create that safe space for them, is that you have to like suffer in silence. And then that bringing up the issues that you see or feel is not right, because you should feel that you're at a privilege to even be there. You should be grateful, you know.
Hmm.
So I think the other point that you made that's really important for our listeners to hear is that, I think reading through documents like this, familiarizing yourself with what your rights are in your state, within your jurisdiction. When we've all, unfortunately, almost all of us, I can say safely probably, that we've all been in a certain situation in the workplace where we know something's not right, or something is being
Hmm.
to us or discriminatory, and it's like, how do I even begin to address it, or how do I name it, who do I talk to? Because in a lot of,
Hmm.
let's be honest, HR is there to protect the company, not the individual. Like that's the
Right.
liability piece. And so it does feel like that you don't have some place to turn. So I think having terminology, knowing and understanding what your basic rights are, or should even be, is a really great place to start. So let's start covering those. I'd love to have you share with us a little bit about each of the 12 core goals and what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And bear with me. There's a lot here. So don't fall asleep on me. I promise you it's important. So we start with number one, a fair and equitable workplace free from discrimination and retaliation. This is our basic protection against gender-based workplace discrimination that you find under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And the Bill of Rights outlines ideas for how we further strengthen this protection. And I should mention here that Title VII provides protection based on a number of classifications, including gender, race, ethnicity, religion. So one thing we really drive home is that discrimination often happens in an intersectional way. Many women face it based on multiple factors. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Second is freedom from sexual and other forms of harassment work. This falls under that broader protection against gender discrimination, but courts have carved out kind of some additional standards that one, make it more difficult to challenge sexual harassment, but again, those standards are important for us to know and be thinking about, again, so that we're making sure we're making the case for us and we're advocating for ourselves in the right way. um, Third is pay equity, which falls under both existing protections against discrimination under Title VII, as well as we have our Federal Equal Pay Act, which mandates equal pay for equal work based on gender. And this is an area where the law is specifically focused on gender and not other classifications. And I should mention here, this is a area where we do a lot of work because, again, while the Equal Pay Act is so critical, the way it is drafted, it also creates so many obstacles and challenges for women to actually bring an equal pay complaint in a way that's going to be successful.
Mm.
And so that's where some of these reforms are absolutely critical. Um, Fourth is a living wage and freedom from unjust wage practices. And here we are recognizing that the current federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is absurd. And I think one thing we don't talk about is how it's a gendered issue, that it disproportionately harms women because women make up the majority of minimum wage workers across the country. And this is also kind of one of the purposes, as I mentioned, about the Bill of Rights, is that there are issues that kind of facially embody discrimination against women. And I think there are a host of issues that we don't focus on as much, but they are disproportionately harming women, everywhere and anywhere you go. Fifth is freedom from economic insecurity. So this highlights the need for stronger supports, public benefits for low-income women and families. And I think the data is showing us that from the past years, the increase in public benefits for families has already resulted in a large number of children coming out of poverty. So, I can't stress how important this piece is. Sixth is equal access to higher paying jobs, economic opportunity, and leadership pathways. So here we're really highlighting strategies and legislation to move women into higher paying jobs and to create other opportunities for women to earn higher incomes and have economic mobility. Seventh is a safe and healthy workplace. And the importance, I think this is another area where obviously health and safety applies across the board, irrespective of your gender. But I think the pandemic really showed us the ways in which, for example, the very large number of women working in the healthcare industry were called upon to, work at very high risk with, very low pay, and without adequate health and safety precautions. So, and this is also an area where we're starting to talk a little bit more about sexual harassment, not just as, a form of gender discrimination, but something that's critical to workplace health and safety. Eighth is freedom from discrimination for survivors of gender-based violence. Survivors of gender-based violence face extreme vulnerabilities when trying to leave an abuser. And this is often where we see their financial security unravel at a time when they need it most. And, it's shocking the things we see in this area. We represent a lot of women who are bringing employment claims based on domestic violence status. For example, we're representing a woman right now who, was the victim of domestic violence. She appeared at her job with her 2 children after moving into a domestic violence shelter to seek help from her employer. Under New York City law, where she's based, there's actually a requirement that employers provide that type of assistance in the form of what we call a reasonable accommodation. And with about 4 weeks, she was terminated from her job. And this is someone who was working in that job for over 6 years, right? And so it's shocking sometimes the things we see. And I think, this is something that everyone needs to keep in mind because, it happens all of a sudden, and a lot of times you can't anticipate it. Ninth is the right to decide if and when to have a child absent policing or interference, which we all know has become all the more important after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And there are so many dimensions to this, from asserting the right to abortion, facilitating travel and supports out of state, protecting data and other forms of privacy for pregnant women, fighting criminalization, and ensuring access to kind of basic healthcare. And 10th is the right to have a child safely, free from discrimination and financial penalty. This speaks to the need to, for paid family leave, paid sick time, pregnancy accommodations for breastfeeding, all of those things that come into play kind of once you're pregnant and plan to carry to term, and what happens kind of immediately after you give birth. 11th is the right to work and raise a family free from discrimination and financial penalty. And this really speaks to the need for childcare and the prohibition against discrimination, not just based on gender, but familial status. So I think in so many scenarios, we find that it can be very hard to prove gender discrimination because, you're making several causal connections, whereas a lot of times on its face, the discrimination is really based on the fact that you have children, right? Employers sometimes ask those questions in interviews. Do you have children? How much time, do you spend? Are you going to have to take time off? Do you anticipate your children are going to be sick? These are all things that, yeah. Again, things that are shocking, but still happen fairly frequently. And lastly, at 12, we have the right to act collectively towards economic equality and workplace justice. We've seen this as just an essential protection, to have workers have the ability to come together and have the freedom to engage in collective action through various different avenues so that they're both securing stronger protections and safeguards for their existing rights, and so that they also just have an opportunity to be talking about what's happening to them at work. We found that women feel incredibly isolated and disempowered. I think there's sometimes no point at which you feel more isolated and disempowered when you are facing some form of workplace discrimination or a violation. Um, and I think talking, as I said before, talking with your peers about the experiences you're going through is such an important step, because it's that point at which you realize that you are in fact not at all alone.
Yeah, no, 100%. We've had a few members go through some similar things. And I think the thing I found most probably traumatizing for them, especially pre-COVID, when we were in the office 5 days a week, is a lot of times as they were going through these processes of litigation with their workplace based on discrimination, sexual harassment, bigger things even, that they still had to come and show up to work every day, and just face, whoever it might have been that offended, or groups that may know things and say things. And so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy because you read all of these 12 and it's just, all of this is like, well, duh, yeah, these should be the rights of anyone that walks into the world and goes to work somewhere. And it's like one of those things where, if you think about it and you flip it the other way, outside of parental leave, we could do a better job for our men there too, our dads out there. But just even
Mm-hmm.
if you were to flip that, would you ever have to write these words down or demand these things for the opposite sex? With the exception of that one? Nope, not really, because it's just expected. It's just given.
Yep.
And so I think that's what I loved about this document, that it really kind of drove home the fact that while we have made great strides in equality to some degree in some areas, we still have so far to go. So kind of,
Absolutely.
I'm sure as you were reading through some of those, our listeners kind of heard, felt, or kind of knew there was something within that maybe they need to kind of think about, ask, address. What resources do women have if they feel like their rights at work have been violated? Where should they even start?
So I'll start by pointing out our legal toolkit for women's economic equality, which really mirrors the Bill of Rights in terms of the issues that are covered, but it is really meant to identify existing protections that women should know about and guidance on how women can assert their rights. While our toolkit is New York State focused, it also includes all of the relevant federal protections. And I think it really serves as a guide for women in other states to identify the types of legal protections to look out for in your own state. And, this is something where doing a Google search really goes a long way, and you'll find stuff that you didn't expect. I think, at Legal Momentum, we are in the practice of doing a lot of these state by state guides that provide, targeted information about certain types of legal protections. So, for example, we're producing one now that looks at protections for survivors of gender-based violence state by state. What are those employment law protections? And in doing the research for that, I think even as lawyers, sometimes we're surprised at what we're able to dig up that's in the law that you didn't really realize was there in the first place. They're often, and in states where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So I think that's a really important starting point. Second, there are a host of local and national organizations and law firms out there that have resources and can provide legal assistance. And while I can't list them all on this podcast, I will note that my organization at Legal Momentum, we have a national helpline, and individuals can call or email us, and we will be happy to, help link you to those resources and organizations. And in a limited number of cases, we will provide direct assistance or representation. And our helpline number, I can provide it. It's 1-800-646-0297. And the email address is help@lmhelpline.org. And so you can, use both of those avenues. I think here I will say that I can't stress how important it is to seek out information or speak with an advocate or an attorney as early in the process as you can, because it can really help you follow the right steps, preserve your claims, and really take action in a timely manner. there are so many times when women come to us late in the process and we can't help them because they've missed important deadlines. They, haven't documented the problem in the right way, in a way that's kind of gives us grounds to proceed in one direction or the other, or they've gone down the wrong path in terms of trying to resolve the issue, and it becomes much harder to kind of mitigate. So, and this is, I would love to say that the laws that we have on the books are like really fantastic protections against discrimination. I think they are valuable, necessary first steps, but the way they are drafted, they really present a number of limitations and obstacles, and they really require women to go about addressing discrimination in a very particular way. And so I think that's why it's so important. There's no way we can expect everyone to kind of have a grasp of all of the technical requirements that are in these laws. As lawyers, we ourselves are trying to juggle and make sense of them. And so it is really critical that you try to get that guidance early.
Yeah, and that brought me to another thought too, because I think that's another thing, outside of feeling powerless, feeling isolated and alone, not having a name for what it is that you're experiencing, it's much less knowing what, state or federal laws or protections might be in place. I know for a lot of women, they're just like, lawsuit means money, like I'm going to have to pay. And obviously women were already underpaid. And, so what do you have to say about how when women take that first step? Because then that might be the thing that holds them back from sooner versus later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is exactly why it's important to act early, because I think in so many scenarios, litigation is not the path you want to go down. It's not the recommended path. It can be incredibly costly. It can be financially, it can be costly in terms of your reputation. It can be emotionally costly. I don't think we think about the emotional toll it takes to, bring a case, to have to be to then have kind of the spotlight be placed on you and your workplace conduct, and so I think that's why really at the end of the day, I don't think the necessary goal or the first goal is to go down the path of litigation. I think there are other avenues to try to address a problem, and so that's why it's important to kind of talk it through early. And sometimes it's also a matter of documenting the violation as well. Like there's so many steps that need to be taken in terms of making sure you're keeping track of what's happening, in case you do end up wanting to make a case. And I think in addition to bringing a lawsuit, there are these administrative agencies at the federal level. So there's the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. In that case, you actually have to go through the EEOC in order to bring a lawsuit. But at the local level, for example, there are oftentimes agencies, human rights agencies, that you can initiate your claim there, and it's a much less high profile process. Oftentimes they have mechanisms for free arbitration or mediation, and so and you don't necessarily need a lawyer. You don't have the same legal fees, and so that's also one avenue that people can explore.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I 100% agree. Document, like a screenshot, save stuff.
Yeah.
Email it to yourself outside of work if you have anything like that. Yeah, you never want to be without that background and information, especially if you do end up having to make a case. That's such great advice. Do you have any
Right.
other like last bits of advice before we hop over and see if our live audience has any questions for you?
I think one thing I'll just mention too, in addition to kind of this idea of bringing the administrative complaint, I was talking about this idea of prevention. And one thing we do help women with kind of regularly is doing that early intervention, right? So if you are aware that there's a law in place that protects you, there's oftentimes a conversation you can have with your employer. So for example, here in New York, we had someone who approached us who worked at a hospital. She was going to have a baby. She had kind of unusual hours. And so when she approached her employer, she asked for, she was informing them that she was going to be needing to take paid family leave, which in New York State is
Mhm.
legally required, and depending on your employment status and whether you've accrued the time, and we assessed her case and determined that she had. And when she asked her employer told her she was not eligible, so she came to us. She was kind of aware of what was available because she called our helpline and we told her. And then from there, we walked her through the steps of, this is what the law requires. Go back to your employer and talk it through and let them know. And she did that. And while it was for her, being pregnant, kind of getting prepared to take leave, having another child, the fact that you're on top of that, having to educate your employer, who's a very large hospital in New York City, is again absurd. But it was something that helped her get that paid family leave that she was entitled to without having to take any type of legal action, or without having the situation escalate.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. That's fantastic because that conversation comes up a lot, not having paid medical leave in the majority of our states. We have a lot of women who work for startup small companies, but then even bigger businesses that just don't even know what their rights are in the state. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think it's really interesting too that like you said, there's always stipulations and loopholes that make things even harder to achieve. It's like,
Yep.
so you have to be working so much time before we'll give you leave.
Mm-hmm.
We'll give you leave, but you have to be here for a year first. So that you can make that work, right? Like things still happen. But then if it happens, you can't do anything about it and you can't get leave for it. It's like,
I think what you raise is such an important point, and it's something that we're constantly very cognizant of, is like, how do we simplify our laws, and how do we make sure that they just apply to everyone? At this point, the fact that there are all these kind of ridiculous carve outs for this, carve outs for that. I mean, even when we're writing a guide for women, I find it to be a little, you know, silly that we are constantly having to put in these very specific provisions of, if you work for an employer with 4 or more employees, these rights apply to you. And these are things that we're always having to work in, whereas at the end of the day, a law should be applying to every type of worker across the board. And that's something we're working towards, is just simplifying these laws, making sure they're much more easy to navigate, and that they apply to everyone.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, because it's just basically writing in bias and towards the law when you're doing it that way. So
Yeah, absolutely. And making them hard to use and inaccessible.
yeah, exactly. Outside of just not even being aware, which hopefully the Bill of Rights starts to help you all get curious about that and look within your state and district what's there for you. All right, do we have any questions from our live audience? You can either type it into the chat or you can feel free to come off of mute and ask Sahar yourself. No questions? Okay. I'm curious for our listeners, because I know you guys you're listening, you might be multitasking, but I'm curious too, what was helpful? Was there anything, and you can type it in the chat or you can come off of mute, but I would love to hear from you. What was helpful from today's conversation? This was a big, important conversation. It was a lot to take in, and I'm sure that you're going to have more to go through. But does anybody have anything they want to share that was like a good takeaway?
Hey, Amy, it's Christy.
Hey, Chris.
I think it was just mostly about getting in front of the situation and how important that is. Like utilizing the resources that are available to you when you encounter a situation. So I really appreciated that.
100%, Christy. Thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that, because it's very important to you want to get ahead of this stuff. You don't want to be on the tail end having to react and respond to Sahar's point. It's financially, emotionally, it wrecks you in a bit. Not always, but it is more emotional than anything too. And then Grace threw into the chat, so I want to make sure she is heard. This is very helpful information and education as someone who is new to working in the corporate world post-college. That's great. Yeah, Grace, you're off to a fantastic start. I'm so glad that you decided to listen in. I'm glad you found it helpful.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that feedback. And just to kind of tell you a story along those lines, it's funny, when we were working on the legal toolkit for women's economic equality, one of the things we were doing is that we shared the draft with a number of kind of community-based organizations that were serving women, that in certain vulnerable groups who we really wanted to make sure we're capturing guidance for them. So immigrant women, women in some of these lower wage industries like domestic workers, farm workers, and then survivors of gender-based violence. And it was funny, some of the feedback we got from just some of the advocates who were themselves lawyers, but they're lawyers focused in different areas. The ones who are helping us out, one of the women was like, "Oh, thanks for this. I reviewed it and tried to provide the guidance, but also I learned so much in terms of all of these protections that I actually didn't know were available." So, it's crazy to think about, how little we tend to know about our rights because we're so busy doing other things, and dealing with our urgent daily tasks.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's very eye-opening. Well, Sahar, thank you so much again, and thank you for all of this amazing and important work that you're doing to help educate and empower women from like a systematic change standpoint to a legal standpoint, but even just having the wherewithal for yourself to kind of hear and deal with all these stories. Protect yourself, protect your energy. You're doing awesome work. We're all behind you and what you're doing, and I'm so glad you came on today to share and hopefully educate and empower some more of our listeners.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was such a pleasure being with you all.
Awesome. All right, ladies, that's all for today. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and we will see you next week. Bye.